Alright guys, so in this video I played Far Cry 5 in 2023 for the first time. I'll be giving an overall review and my thoughts on the game to let you know if it still holds up 5 years later after releasing back in March 2018. Now this is a series where I've played through each main Far Cry game in order from the first, and of course 6 is up next and that's the final one in the series. So if you do go on to enjoy or find this video helpful, then hit that like button down below, and if story video games are your thing, then maybe even considering subscribing to the channel as well. I have various reviews on the channel with a playlist of a series that I've done in the description down below, and my last video should be at the end of this video. Now let's jump into Far Cry 5. Now to start off, Far Cry 5 is a very different game to the previous games in a lot of different ways. The game is set in Montana, therefore there's many farmlands, lakes, hilly areas, endless fir trees, and I mean endless. As you can see, the entire map is scattered with them. And of course this can be seen as sort of boring to some players because there's not much variation in the world, with not only it being filled with the same tree over and over, but also just the same grasslands and stretches of land. Now I do understand that many players would easily find this boring to sort of play in because it always feels the same, and I do partially agree with this. That's of course from a gameplay and engagement standpoint, but overall I think the world is one of my favourites. This is just personal preference of course, and I loved it just because I sort of prefer this theme of, you know, rocky mountains, wide plains, and overall a somewhat peaceful and rural area in terms of the appearance of course, similar to sort of Firewatch or a Days Gone theme, but overall there for sure could have been some more additions, and the overall engagement you get out of the world after a while is sort of lackluster, and the overall making of it seemed a bit lazy. There is wildlife and NPCs you meet even if you're in a random place, but nowhere near the level of making it really fun and captivating. There's of course many random people you meet in the towns, but if you're hunting or simply travelling through, then it does become really boring because of the very little amount of encounters that happen. And even when they do happen, it's very minimal, and you're being told to kill one target, and as I mentioned, not only people but the wildlife you see are a fun aspect, and they do add a bit to making the game feel alive and not so, you know, lonely and static, but even they are slightly uncommon to spot, let alone hunt down. And compared to the previous games, the hunting is basically the same and very basic in a huge open world like this, where you need as much engagement and random moments as you can get due to the world being so repetitive and exhausting. So basically anywhere out of the towns and outposts is very dull to play in. Then the majority of the missions and areas you will be are in those livelier areas with many more people, that being civilians and guards that you can interact with a lot, and they do have a variety of conversations, and all of the people you see are either working by doing their own small task and own thing, or simply just passing by. So this does make the game have that alive aspect that, you know, Red Dead 2 or the Witcher 3 games would have, but nowhere near the level overall. Now aside from all this, it doesn't take away from the overall visual and graphics that are heavily upgraded in Far Cry 5. It does make sense from being, you know, 4 years after Far Cry 4, but the detail in the foragery and the rockery, which you really do notice up close, and although the overall world isn't varied from a, you know, zoned out perspective, and it isn't really that colourful either, but when you focus on the variety in sort of bushes and the different wildflowers on the grass as you pass by, there is a lot of attention to detail. And just the overall texture in material on brick and wooden buildings. The graphics and lighting is of course brought out even more in the cutscenes, where the characters look so real, and I can never get bored of a cutscene because of how mesmerising it looks. It does do a great job at making the game seem real in terms of its graphics realism, but as I mentioned, it is a shame that this wasn't transferred in the encounters and variety of the map to make it feel more alive. Now I do like to talk about the gameplay of Far Cry 5, and it does seem like Far Cry 3 onwards has the gameplay you would expect in a Far Cry game. The earlier games had a lot of improvement to do, but the shooting mechanics and gameplay doesn't always have a huge difference. Now it's in the terms of the way it pushes you to independently progress in the story, which may sound slightly confusing, but basically it's heavily reliant on the open world system, and that you do need to move through the world and take down a handful of areas before you go on to the next part in the story. And sometimes it's a hefty amount to be completed, which if you are, you know, more of an only story player, it was much easier beforehand, but in Far Cry 5, it's much more open world driven in gameplay. Very early on in the game, you are pushed into taking down several big areas where it's always a taking down of an outpost or just a small area that you need to do, which is usually a side content thing that you would do when you progress through the game. And it's up to you if you know, want to do it or when you'd like to do it. Maybe you'll do it when you travel around around the area or come back to it later. However, with a big amount of this being pushed early on to, progress through the main story quest, it takes away from the engagement and can easily become so exhausting. This is carried on throughout the majority of the game, which with not much of a difference really, so I'm sure it's very easy for a player to become bored and turn off. Now, I did mention that they are the small in-world encounters and events that you'll experience, but it's minimal with you destroying a place or saving a civilian. In terms of side missions, where I didn't complete them all in their entirety and probably not enough, but I would say there's a slight increase in variety. There are fun air missions with planes which were great and add to it more. It's just where the overall main quest gameplay that everyone plays through, or just the world itself, are really both in need of more variety, because if you mix the two the way they did in this game, it's easily repetitive. The gun handling and shooting mechanic is much easier in Far Cry 5, which is a good and bad for some people. They seem to go back and forth with how challenging they want the gameplay to be in Far Cry. It does seem like every game is different, which I suppose is a good thing. In this game it's mainly because there's no recoil at all on the shooting, and it's so smooth, which does feel really satisfying but could also be tedious after a while, as it's sort of the same thing and it isn't much of a challenge or difference in the overall shooting mechanics. However, the variety of weapons to choose from and upgrades is a slight improvement, with flamethrowers, miniguns, bows, machine guns, rocket launchers, one being a literal shovel launcher that, you guessed it, launches shovels. Of course, much more selection in the usual ARs, shotguns, handguns, etc. Then there's the stealth aspect in Far Cry 5, where finally we have some variety and love put into stealth, where in the previous games there's either none at all and the AI will spot you no matter what and there's no stealth animation. Then there's the other games where there is less detection and an animation, but that's about it. In this game, I'm glad to say that they really improved it, with many different takedowns to do that are so unique, and of course many different melee weapons to pick up off the ground that are just lying around, whether that be a metal pipe or a baseball bat, shovel, or just whatever really. And the objects and scenery are implemented into stealth, where you can either use a wall or a table to stealthily take down or drag someone over it, or just help with covering the takedown. It always doesn't have to be up close as well. You can easily use these objects to throw at an enemy, which never got tiring, and of course the usual bow as well. Then following the aspects of sort of Assassin's Creed, where you can perform an air takedown and jump off a high ledge or a zip line to jump on an enemy and silently take them down. So a much more varied system this time, with lots to implement, and made use of the open world and gameplay to take away from getting bored slightly. Now, I've heard many people compare this game to Just Cause, which I can totally see where they're coming from, with the areas that I already mentioned in open world, but also in the weapons and tools. All of the tools to use are somewhat fun, but not an awful lot of variety in this as well, as they might as well have just kept one that sets off an explosion, and that's basically it, because that's basically what they're there for. Pretty much all of them are just blowing things up. You can upgrade and alter weapons, the same as usual, but what was interesting is the customization and array of vehicles to spawn in anywhere, which was fun, and the driving is basically the same and fairly easy to control, due to the game using the whole map for the main quests. Very early on you have already covered the main areas, as the game makes you go to them, so I suppose it is a lot of driving, but as it's at the start of the game, you will then be able to fast travel to all those locations afterwards, which is great. But when you do go to buy vehicles, there's so many options that vary a lot from each other, with different weapon mounts, miniguns, quad and dirt bikes, that took a bit to get used to compared to usual. You can use planes and helicopters, which adds to the fun when raiding outposts or simply just travelling over the map if you want, which was very different. The skill tree system in Far Cry 5 is roughly the same, that doesn't add anything game changing basically, being set into 5 sections, with many perks like the usual faster reloads and swimming faster, etc. The newer ones don't really improve anything at all, and most of them are just not worth it. They probably could have halved it all or even quartered it, so it's a shame, as it would have been cool to see better and more unique perks. Now it's time for the story and narrative of Far Cry 5. Now, in this game, they've gone back to the moot protagonist again. Personally, I'm not a huge fan. I feel like it takes away from the story and just feels less engaging, because why would you not talk back? It's also heavily reliant on the other characters and mainly the antagonist, which was very present in Far Cry 2. And it did work pretty well, as the antagonist was interesting and not like usual. Also, just the overall game was a lot smaller. But the other side characters weren't great, which was similar in this game, where the side cast are somewhat likeable but not near enough as I hoped, especially when your main character doesn't talk. However, they did seem more lifelike in terms of the voice acting and performance capture, with this game being a lot newer, so they do have, more personality, but with the vast amount of characters you come across in the game, and there's a lot of them, not all of them are going to be so engaging, and the majority of them aren't. Now, the main antagonist of Joseph Seed and his family is of course the biggest aspect of the story and narrative, where it does have a lot of pressure due to the lackluster sidecast and mute character. Funny enough though, I really did like Joseph as a villain, and he does do an amazing job at portraying his evilness, but also how he's trying to spread that religious message, where funny enough you start to sort of think twice about him, which was similar and a lot more in Far Cry 2 because it was sort of different, with the Jackal who does have a small amount of respect towards you, and some points where he starts to be seen as not totally evil. But just the way Joseph becomes so intimidating towards your character and gets into his head makes him really good. As I said, he has a family and they also play major roles as well. That's a huge part of the story, with Joseph being the main leader, these members being Faith, John and Jacob Seed, which I believed were just as good as the main antagonist. And this way of having a family of villains is what basically saves the story. They all have unique and evil personalities, unlike the variety in the sidecast. John was probably my favourite out of the 3 side villains, of course that's not including Joseph, as he does come off as very ruthless and he basically manipulates and interrogates people to then go on to torture them. Therefore he is probably the most cruel to his captives. Overall he's the most sadistic out of the 3, which is a common theme with the whole family. Then there's Faith, who is probably the most interesting and conflicting character, who you would probably be most confused about, as she sort of tries to get into your head and can hallucinate people with her ability, but deep down it's like she doesn't want to and actually cares, and that is more common as you progress further into the game. Therefore out of the 3, as weird as it may sound, she's the most caring. And of course Jacob Seed, who is also very upfront and forceful. However, he's probably the best at brainwashing your character and getting into their head. It's sort of a tie between John and him, with always the portrayed idea of how he'll use you. I must say that the overall structure of the game story was all over the place, with random moments of you getting kidnapped over and over, but spread throughout the game, and then especially with the lengthy parts that split up an engaging part of the game, where you'll be fully invested and suddenly you'll move on to helping random people that doesn't add anything, and goes on for way too long. So then it easily loses track and becomes so repetitive and obvious what's about to happen, which was similar to the gameplay as mentioned, and can easily become so ongoing and tedious, taken away from the good aspects. I also think the whole ending was done really well, and it's very interesting to play out. There is multiple endings to the game which I won't mention of course, but I believe it wrapped up the game pretty well. Some people may think different, but I'd say overall the whole theme of having a religious cult for the main story was so interesting, and although it may not be perfect due to how it's structured, it was one of my favourite themes for a narrative in Far Cry, and it was written really well, and the main villain's family have a lot of meaning to them. So I believe that's where I wrap up my review of Far Cry 5 in 2023, and I know for half the people they won't enjoy the game so much, and others may not mind it, so this game is very hard to say if it's worth your time. Judging it from what I've mentioned and my thoughts, which may be different to others, I would say start off your playthrough, and if you're unsure, and to be honest you'll soon find out if you'll enjoy it in terms of the gameplay, as in the first hour or so the overall gameplay is basically what you'll get and expect throughout the whole game, and you do get a good idea of the story. So for me personally, I would say it's worth checking out, and overall I enjoyed the game. There were many aspects I really liked in Far Cry 5, and I hope this video was helpful to anyone that was thinking of playing it. If it was, or you simply enjoyed it, then hit that like button down below to let me know, and if you do enjoy these type of story video game reviews, then consider subscribing to the channel as well. As I said, I have an array of reviews on the channel on many games. At the moment it is Far Cry, with 6 up next, which should be interesting. And my last video will be at the end. Thank you for watching until the very end, I really appreciate it, and bye bye.